Welcome everyone to the Winners and Losers webinar. Today we're examining the trust and distrust rankings for the year to September 2021. As many of you know, we at Roy Morgan have been monitoring trust and especially distrust since 2018. CEOs and directors sometimes ask why it matters if Australians distrust their brand or company, particularly if they still keep buying. They're really asking about material impact. So for the first time today, we're going deeper into this body of data and exploring the critical markets or subpopulations that are so important to our clients, like investors, voters on different sides of politics, and big spending premium consumers. And we're asking questions like, have investors finally forgiven AMP? Do ALP voters distrust Rio Tinto more than coalition voters do? And who's behind the increasing levels of distrust for Harvey Norman? Let me introduce my co-presenter, social scientist Dr. Ross Honeywill. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Michelle. The past year has been filled with a wide range of challenges to Australian companies and, of course, to Australian consumers. After you've run through the trust and distrust analysis, I'll be taking a look at a few of those challenges and have a crack at explaining just what's going on.
But first, let's have a short discussion about distrust.
Well, everyone gets trust. We understand what it means. After all, we hear it mentioned every day by corporate leaders, by governments, by politicians. Brand new CEOs bringing a new broom to companies talk in terms of rebuilding trust, and politicians talk about the importance of trust, particularly around election time. So one thing we know for sure, Michelle, is that we're going to be bombarded by the trust word in the run-up to the federal election.
Sure will be.
Now, trust is important, of course it is. Society wouldn't be able to operate without it. Trust is the glue that holds society together. But distrust is a very, very different beast. It's, if you like, the blowtorch that melts the ties that bind us. But as you frequently say, Michelle, distrust is not simply an absence of trust. It's much, much more dangerous. Just look at the freedom marches over the past few months. These weren't people with low trust or no trust. These were Australians for whom trust was no longer relevant. They'd moved up what we might call the arc of distrust. It all started when they began to doubt. They doubted rules, they doubted the people making the rules, and doubt quickly turned to suspicion. They became suspicious of what they were hearing and what they were being told. And that made them open to alternative narratives, to theories that were not part of the mainstream. And they became so anxious about what they were hearing and thinking that they became afraid, fearful that their way of life was seriously under threat. And from there on, it was a very short step to action, to move from a passive lack of trust to a very dangerous level of distrust, from reluctant acceptance to active self-protection, taking to the streets to win back what they considered their personal freedoms. Whether they were right or not, or just gullible victims of right-wing conspiracy theories is really unimportant. What they were experiencing and what we were witnessing is distrust and its activism in full flight.
I think you've hit on something really important, Ross. This concept of trust being passive and distrust being active. So when trust turns to distrust, customers are more likely to become active and even activists.
Yeah.
I've had company directors of the big four banks say things to me like, Michelle, management tell us we have high levels of trust, a high net promoter score and high customer satisfaction. But we know there's a problem with the way Australians see us. They want a royal commission. They're calling for blood. What's wrong is that management are only looking at one side of the coin, the passive one. They're only measuring trust. The other side of the coin is distrust, and it's active. Customers either actively desert them, or worse, actively call for a royal commission. Just look at AMP for a real-life example. Corporate scandals and revelations in the Royal Commission turned trust not into some kind of passive absence of trust, but into active distrust, and billions of investment dollars and thousands of customers flooded out the doors.
And that's exactly the difference between passive trust and active distrust, isn't it?
Absolutely. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at the levels of trust and, of course, importantly, distrust in the different industry sectors. First, supermarkets are still the most trusted sector in Australia. You can see the first green column on the left side of this graph. Those in green above the line have a net trust score. Their trust score is higher than their distrust score, so when we subtract distrust from trust, they're in positive territory, net trust. And those in red below the centre line have a net distrust score. And the sector with the most red is banks. The banking sector has the highest net distrust score in the year ending September. Now, some of you might recall that in June, social media was the most distrusted sector. So for banks to push social media out of the #1 most distrusted ranking is really something. And to put this in some kind of perspective, the banking industry is now 4 times more distrusted than gambling and 10 times more distrusted than politicians. And that's saying something.
That is saying something.
Now let's look at the individual winners and losers. Woolworths and Coles are still the 2 most trusted brands in Australia. They've been in the winner's circle ever since COVID hit. Both chains, of course, stepped up during COVID and pushed Bunnings down to 3rd. And some of you were with us at the last webinar and will recall the ABC's dramatic loss of trust over the past 18 months. Well, the tide appears to be turning, with the ABC jumping 5 rankings from 19th to 14th. This is still outside its traditional place in the top 10 though, and it's a definite improvement. And rounding out the winners and losers, David Jones has jumped into the top 20, Myer has dropped 3 places, and Apple has fallen from the tree. It's no longer in the top 20. With our conversation about distrust in mind, now let's look at the dark side. Harvey Norman is again the standout. Its net distrust ranking jumped 9 places. The retail giant is now in the top 10 most distrusted brands for the first time. Facebook and Telstra still hold the top 2 places as Australia's most distrusted brands, and Google has continued to deteriorate. It's now the 3rd most distrusted brand, while Twitter and Rio Tinto improved, but only slightly. Now, earlier I promised to look at what brands investors trust and distrust. So this is what we learned. Now, the investment community is a broad church, so I asked our data scientists to look for Australians who own shares or have managed investments, and they found more than 5,000 of these investors in our single source database. We see here their top 10 on the right compared to the general population's top 10 trusted brands or companies. And when it comes to trust, investors rank Qantas higher than the general population. And interestingly, they also rank Myer higher than the average shopper. This is good news for the current board of Myer. Some of you will remember me quoting the Unilever CEO saying our current market capitalisation is 130 billion euros, but our asset value is only 30 billion. The 100 billion euro balance is made up by trust. So the more trusted Myer is, the stronger the potential market capitalisation, and the more likely investors are to buy Myer shares. It becomes very circular. Moving again now to the dark side and staying with investors, investors distrust AMP, Rio Tinto and Crown Casinos even more than the population as a whole does. This reveals a real sensitivity by investors to any corporate wrongdoing. Now, I don't think this means investors are better people, nicer people, or more moral people, but they are attuned to the powerful economic link between distrust and risk to market cap. For example, AMP, Rio Tinto and Crown all experienced corporate wrongdoings and demonstrated profound moral blindness that resulted in very public board and C-suite dismissals and a critical loss of social licence. As Australians, we were all disappointed. From an investor perspective, soaring levels of distrust also caused a significant hit to their share price and market capitalisation.
Earlier, Michele asked the question, have investors forgiven AMP? But before she gives you an answer, I'll do a quick AMP recap. Before the Financial Services Royal Commission, AMP had virtually zero distrust. It had been a really trusted household name for generations. Then, due to the revelations during the Royal Commission that AMP had charged customers $1 billion in fees for no service at all, AMP became the most distrusted brand in Australia. It even pushed Facebook out of the top spot. Subsequent sexual allegations against executives only fueled the distrust blowtorch. AMP's FY18 net profit plummeted by 97% and its share price, of course, crashed. So back to you, Michele, for the truth about what Australians think of AMP.
Well, in August of this year, not long after the new CEO, Alexis George, took the reins at AMP, I commissioned a snap survey of more than 1,000 Australians and asked them if they trusted or distrusted AMP. You can see from this graph that 75% of Australians distrust AMP. Note, this is not just investors, this is everyone. Men, women, old people, young people, and in every state of Australia. So that's the whole population. But what about investors and the investor question? Have they forgiven AMP? Well, the answer is not entirely. Since the dark days of the Royal Commission, AMP's distrust ranking has slowly improved. This chart shows investor rankings of distrusted brands, and you can see on the left column in 2018-19, AMP was in the top spot, the most distrusted brand. Then in 2019-20, Facebook returned to the #1 position, and by September this year, investors had moved AMP down to being the 5th most distrusted brand in Australia. But along the way, one of the respondents to our survey said something about AMP that has really stuck with me. They said of AMP, they seem to be on shaky ground. I took all my money out a while back. I thought they were going to tank. It's not that I don't trust them. I just think they're finished. So there's that powerful economic link between distrust and risk to market cap. Now, I know the new AMP CEO, Alexis George. She came from ANZ, and she's making all the right noises. In October, she launched a new national advertising and marketing campaign. Too late for this report, but if there's any more forgiveness to be given to AMP, we should see it over the next couple of quarters, so stay tuned. And now, what about voters of different persuasions? Roy Morgan has a proud history of political polling, so it was with great interest that I embarked on an analysis of what and why voters for different political parties trust and distrust. So we have here from the left the total population, ALP voters, coalition voters, and Greens voters. And the first thing that struck me was that coalition voters look a lot like investors when it comes to the brands that they trust. But there's one spectacular difference, BHP. See, it's number 10 on the coalition list of brands that they trust. Coalition voters trust BHP so much it made it into their top 10. For the population at large, BHP is ranked 85th. I can't recall ever seeing such an incredible differential in rankings. And as we saw earlier, the ABC has improved, but it hasn't yet made it back into the nation's top 10 most trusted brands. And the same goes for ALP and coalition voters. No ABC in their top 10 either. Now, it's probably not surprising that the ABC is not in the coalition voters' top 10, but for many it'll be surprising that it didn't make it into the ALP voters' top 10. But look at the Greens. That's the right-hand table. The ABC is not only in their top 10, it's in number 2 position. The Greens also trust Australia Post more than any other voters. Turning now to distrust, coalition voters really distrust AMP, even more than investors. Maybe the question in future should be, have coalition voters forgiven AMP?
I think it should.
It probably should. Clearly, many of these voters were AMP investors and customers and were burned during the AMP meltdown. Perhaps they felt foolish that they had trusted too much. Now, a question I posed at the start of this webinar was, do ALP voters distrust Rio Tinto more than coalition voters? It's interesting, I didn't know the answer at the point that we posed the question. But the answer is yes, but only just 8th place for ALP voters and 9th place for coalition voters. I'm really surprised though that Greens voters have Rio Tinto down at number 7, despite Rio's conscious decision to destroy the 46,000-year-old Juukan Caves Indigenous Heritage Site in Western Australia, an act that cost both its chairman and CEO their jobs. Hard to believe that the Greens only have them at number 7 in their most distrusted list. And going back to BHP, remember that coalition voters had BHP in their top 10 most trusted list. Green voters have BHP as their 9th most distrusted brand. That's an extraordinary political divide. Given BHP's announced environmental reforms this year, it'll be very interesting to see how that tracks with Greens voters over the coming quarters. It's interesting too that coalition voters have Huawei on the most distrusted list, but it's nowhere to be seen on Greens voters list. I'm now going to pass to Ross to answer our final question. Who is behind the increasing levels of distrust for Harvey Norman? Is it those big spending premium consumers, Ross?
Well, the answer, Michele, is yes, it is.
Well, don't be shy about elaborating, Ross. Tell us more.
Okay. But first, to answer the question about that, we need to understand who these premium consumers are. For more than 2 decades, it's been my belief that the consumer economy is largely split into two very different types of consumer. So I developed an evidence-based algorithm that turned out to confirm that the population is indeed divided into 2 fundamentally different consumer mindsets, premium or neo, and price-based or traditional. Now, neo is just an acronym for New Economic Order. There's an interesting quote at the bottom of that slide, which you won't be able to read, so I'll help you, from the former marketing director of JB Hi-Fi, Scott Browning, who said, "After 5 years of running our neo strategy, 80% of our revenue was directly generated by the neos in our consumer base." Now, there are almost 5 million high-spending neos in Australia, 4.8 million to be accurate, and 10 million price-based traditional consumers. And despite all this talk about price and spending, it's important to explain that everyone wants the best price. However, for a traditional consumer, everything starts and ends with price. But for neos, price is just the cost of falling in love.
And this is the first time, Ross, we've looked at trust and distrust through this neo lens, isn't it?
It is. And interestingly, these high-value neos are more trusting than everyone else. But they're simultaneously more distrusting. Welcome to the paradox of Planet Neo. What we're really seeing here is that neos have higher trust for brands and sectors that align with their values, but make no mistake, they're constantly alive to breaches of their social contract with a brand. Just look at mining and social media on the right-hand side of this graph. The darker columns are neos and the lighter bars are everyone else. So you can see that neos distrust mining companies and social media more than anyone else. And over on the left-hand side, because they're discerning consumers, they trust their favourite consumer products and brands more. And because they're early adopters of new technology, they trust their favourite tech companies, like Apple, more than everyone else does. Here's the Neo top 10 most trusted brands. That's the table on the right, and the one on the left is everyone else. And there's Apple, always a Neo favourite. And there's the ABC, not as high as the Greens, but it's also a Neo favourite. So after that long preamble, let me answer the question about Harvey Norman. And the answer, Michele, is still yes. Neos are largely responsible for Harvey Norman's high level of distrust. Remember we saw earlier that Harvey Norman had jumped 9 rankings from 18th to become the 9th most distrusted brand in Australia. And Neos have them at the 8th most distrusted brand. Now that's not remarkable in itself, given that all Australians rank at 9th, but what this slide doesn't show is that Neos distrust Harvey Norman 4 times more than traditional consumers. So yes, premium neos are the major contributor to Harvey Norman's increasing levels of distrust. Now, why is any of this relevant? It's really important for Harvey Norman to understand this new economic order. If the company moves more into high value and higher margin merchandise.
Ross, this all raises so many questions, but I'm afraid it's time to bring the session to a close. So thank you, Dr. Honeywill, for another great discussion.
Thank you.
Finally, if anyone would like to ask a question or to get a copy of this presentation, simply email us at askroymorgan@roymorgan.com. And if you'd like to learn more about NEOs, just Google Roy Morgan Premium and watch the terrific animated video. Until next time, have a safe and happy holiday season.